UFC Vegas 75 betting and DraftKings show. We have 14 fights this weekend. I'm Jon Kelly. Let's hear the picks. And we're going to get things started in the light heavyweight division as Modestas Bukauskas comes in as a minus 195 favorite with Zachpowga on the comeback at plus 165. Right off the bat, I think this is a fight you can basically ignore in terms of DraftKings because even Bukauskas as the favorite here, he just doesn't have much upside. We've seen him score as recent as his last fight where he came through with the upset over Tyson Pedro. He scored less than 60 points in a victory, and that really speaks to his game. If he's not able to find a big finish, which he's not super dangerous. I mean, he does have a little bit of power, couple knockout victories, but he started off in the UFC, had that weird stoppage against Andreas Michailidis. Since then, got knocked out brutally by Jimmy Crute. This guy's very hittable on the feet. He's very sloppy. He's more of a leg kicker, but he doesn't really play good defense, and that's why I worry about him at this big of a favorite price tag, even against a guy like Zachpowga, who's known as a very rudimentary striker, very boring guy, solid jab, but he's looking to stay on the outside unless he's pushing you up against the fence. He likes to stay safe. He doesn't really want to get involved in big exchanges, and he's a very boring point fighting style. However, I think the way they match up, it's basically the leg kicks of Bukauskas versus the jab of Zachpowga, and maybe Pauga can add some, cage push, a little bit of wrestling as well. We'll see. But either way, I mean, I don't trust Bukauskas as a big favorite here, and I certainly don't like him on DraftKings. I'm going to side with the underdog here just because I think it's more of a coin flip type of fight, and I think over 15 minutes, I favor the durability and the cardio of Pauga, and neither guy really has upside on DraftKings. So we have 14 fights on this slate. I don't think you need to get cute with either of these guys. I don't think they're going to be very owned, but I think that's the right choice. Next fight up in the bantamweight division, we have Ronnie Lawrence coming in as a minus 180 favorite with the comeback on Dan Argeta at plus 155. And this is a matchup where Ronnie Lawrence is going to be a popular target on DraftKings for good reason, because basically outside of his last fight against Kakramanov, which we'll talk about here in a minute, outside of that, he scored 130 or more points in his two other UFC fights. This guy has a relentless, aggressive wrestling pace, and he's not very good at controlling people. So what that does is it allows his opponents to work back to their feet so that he can land more and more takedowns and rack up points. He scored 6 takedowns in one of those fights, 8 takedowns in the one before that. That's what he's going to do, and he has a motor that he can do that for 15 minutes if he needs to. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows with this kid because his striking is not very good. And he kind of reminds me of Pat Sabatini in terms of the striking because they're very, very good in terms of their wrestling, jiu-jitsu, all that's great. But their striking, they don't really have much and they don't throw much volume, and both of them are pretty hittable. So I worry about that with a guy like Ronnie Lawrence, and coming off that Kakramanov performance where he was beat at his own game. That was concerning. Even in this matchup, not that I think Argeta is anywhere near Kakramanov, but he does come from a wrestling background. He's not super easy to take down initially. Yes, you can control him. Good grapplers have been able to take him down multiple times, and especially once he starts to slow down, you can certainly control this guy. But I think early on, at least, it's going to be harder for Lawrence than I think the market expects here. But regardless, I do think the cardio, the relentless wrestling, I do think that's going to favor him down the stretch here, and I think he gets the job done. So we're going Ronnie Lawrence by decision. That's the official pick, and he's a strong play on DraftKings this week. Next fight up, we have Teresa Bladea coming in as a minus 255 favorite with Gabriella Fernandez on the comeback at plus 215. And this is one where I certainly favor the Bladea side in this, and on DraftKings at 9,500. I like getting up to her in that price range for a couple reasons. For starters, I think maybe she won't be as popular as I think she should be considering this matchup. She's coming off her UFC debut against Natalia Silva, where she was knocked out in the third round. The cardio looks suspect, and that's really the story of her career. Is she's a big girl, she's young, she's likely improving, but the gas tank has never really been there. She's 6-1, a lot of first round finishes, but what she does have, she's very aggressive with her wrestling. She's a powerful wrestler, decent takedowns, and when she gets on top, she is looking to land vicious ground and pound. That was the read on her coming into that Contender Series matchup last season, and even in that debut against Natalia Silva. The difference is Silva, I think, is potentially a future champ. type fighter, and she's very difficult to take down. So Bladea had to work extra hard to try on those takedowns because she doesn't really have much in terms of the striking. And because she taxed her cardio looking for those takedowns, she just didn't have anything left. She turned into a punching bag. That's to be expected against somebody like Silva. Now in this matchup against Fernandez, who just fought Jasmine Jasudavicius, who basically just grounded her for 15 minutes almost. The girl has no idea how to work back to her feet. She is perfectly willing to just sit there and basically do nothing but get controlled on the mat. Now, what I like about Bladea, she's not just going to lay on you like Jasudavicius. Like I said, she is looking to land vicious elbows, and if you turn and give up your back, she's going to take the neck and choke you out. So I think she's very dangerous, very liable to finish. But the good thing is for DraftKings is even if she doesn't get that finish, we are looking at a similar score to Jasudavicius, where we're going to get 2 or 3 takedowns and probably 10 plus minutes of control time. So I think she has one of the highest floors, but also that first round finishing potential as well. So I like Bladea to get it done inside the distance this week, and I think she's a strong target on DraftKings. Which brings us to our next fight in the flyweight division. We have Zalgas Zuma Gulab, a minus 155 favorite, with Felipe Bunez on the comeback at plus 135. Now, Bunez is making his UFC debut. He previously fought over an LFA. He's actually coming off a first round TKO. I think this is a guy, he's 33 years old, solid fighter, pretty much competent wherever the fight goes. You know, on the feet, he's a solid striker. He is going to throw a lot of spinning attacks, which leave him a little bit vulnerable to the takedowns, and I think maybe Zuma Gulab could take advantage there. But as you know, Zuma Gulab is never a guy who pushes an aggressive wrestling pace, even when he has that advantage. He just tends to fight on thin margins, and that's why we've seen him in so many of these close decisions that don't go his way. He's lost 5 of his last 6 fights, and a big reason why is because he's just not doing enough to cement these rounds, and I think that there's a scenario where that happens here. I definitely think Bunez has more upside. I think he probably has more finishing potential as well. He's a better submission grappler. I worry he can give up some takedowns here, but outside of that, I mean, I think this is a pretty close competitive fight. I slightly lean Zuma Gulab because I think he's more proven. I think he can mix in the wrestling a little bit if he decides to. I think he could have success doing that. So I slightly lean towards him. But again, he's not one of those guys that has a ton of upside for DraftKings. So I'm naturally going to sway more in favor of the UFC newcomer in Bunez just for the price. So we're going Zuma Gulab by decision, but in terms of DraftKings, I'm probably going to look to the underdog here. Next up, we have another flyweight matchup between Dennis Bondar, who's a minus 125 favorite currently, and the comeback on Carlos Hernandez is plus 105. Now, if you remember, Dennis Bondar made his UFC debut against Malcolm Gordon, and this was a while back, and the reason for the long layoff is because he had a nasty freak injury. I'm not going to show the full clip here, but basically that fight had started. Gordon started having some serious success tagging Bondar early in that fight. Now, it only lasted about a minute or so before they end up grappling here. And Gordon, you know, sort of ties him up. They get into this weird exchange, and Bondar's elbow literally just like melts and pops out. It's disgusting. So he ended up losing by first round TKO due to injury there. Long layoff, but coming into the UFC from the regional scene, he's known as more of a first round finisher. He's got a ton of finishes on the regional scene, but he hasn't really fought anybody. A lot of these are very low level Ukrainian regional style fights, and I'm just not sure that he's all that talented. Now, what he does have is some pretty good wrestling. He's got good timing on his takedowns. He's not a great control guy, and I think that's where he's going to struggle here against Carlos Hernandez, because Hernandez historically is very hard to control. Yes, he'll give up the takedowns, as we've seen time and time again. We saw it on Contender Series a couple years ago against Daniel Barez, my guy. We saw it even in his UFC debut against Victor Altamirano. I bet him in that spot. He came through as a slight underdog. I'm likely going to bet him here as well. I'm just waiting because it seems like Bondar is taking some action, and I actually like Hernandez. I think he's the cleaner striker. I think the longer this fight goes, I think it's going to play into his favor. I think he's going to have the better cardio. Again, we just haven't really seen Bondar not only tested at this level, but even tested outside the first 7 minutes or so. It just doesn't happen that often. So I think this is one of the better guys he's ever fought. I think I have a lot of questions about him coming off a long layoff where he didn't look good in the couple minutes where he did debut against somebody that I think is worse than Hernandez. So I like Hernandez here. I just think he's better. He's going to be tough to control. I think he wins the striking and gets it done. So we're going Carlos Hernandez by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to our next fight as Christian Canonas comes in as a -165 favorite with the comeback on Kang at +140. And we'll start on the Canonas side. He's actually coming off a first round TKO victory over Khalid Taha. That was in his UFC debut. He previously fought on Dana White's Contender Series, but he seems to be a pretty well-rounded prospect. He's a good striker. He's got a strong jab. He's going to fight behind his jab, likely trying to stay on the outside for the most part, but as we've seen across his regional fights, he's easy to kind of bait into a brawl, and then he's willing to just go at it, swinging in the pocket. Now, I don't think that's going to happen here against Kang, who's more of a grappler. Yes, he has power on the feet. He's actually landed 3 knockdowns over his last 5 fights, so he certainly has the power. He just doesn't have the volume, and so he's more of a grappler. Most of his wins have come by submission. 11 of his 18 wins have come on the mat. I think he is the better submission grappler here, but I don't think Canonas is that easy to take down or that easy to submit. Like, I don't think it's going to be an instant sub if he gets taken down here, and I expect him to have a clear advantage on the feet, and I expect him to take over as the fight goes on because Kang doesn't really have the volume. He doesn't really have the best cardio either. So I expect this fight to favor Canonas the longer it goes, and I think he gets his hand raised. We're going Canonas by decision. That's the official pick. Next fight up, we have another flyweight matchup between Alessandro Costa, a -240 favorite, with the comeback on Jimmy the Brick Flick at +200. And originally, when this fight was booked, I was like, maybe I'll be interested in Flick as an underdog here. But the more I looked into it, the more I'm like, I just can't do it, man, because I think if you're targeting Jimmy Flick, I think you need him against somebody who, A, is not really a huge striking threat on the feet in order to knock him out, but B, also just not a very good defensive grappler. And I think Costa is actually both of those things. You know, he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he's done most of his work actually with his grappling on the regional scene. You know, he holds a black belt, like I mentioned. He's got solid takedowns when he goes to them. He hasn't done it yet at the UFC level or on Contender Series, but I think that was more matchup driven. He does have that in his back pocket here, but I think the game plan for him is going to be to just strike with Jimmy Flick, because that's where he's going to have a serious advantage in terms of the power. And Costa's kind of fallen in love with his hands recently. He's not like a huge knockout guy, but lately he's been sitting down on his punches more over his last couple fights. He's been dropping people. He does have knockout power, and against a guy like Jimmy Flick, who has that glaring issue when it comes to his durability. He's been knocked out a ton of times, some brutal knockouts. So I don't think it's going to take much here. I think Costa finds the chin early, and I think he gets him out. So I think my boy Jimmy the Brick Flick is drawing pretty thin here. This is a great fight to target, whether you want to take the shot on Flick or not. He is cheap. He does have upside. I just don't see him pulling off the submission here against a well-rounded fighter like Costa. So we're going Costa by TKO. That's the official pick. Next fight up in the bantamweight division, we have Raoni Barcelos, a -225 favorite, with Miles Johns on the comeback at +190. And this is a matchup where I'm probably going to piss some people off here, because since the beginning of time, people have thought that Raoni Barcelos is like championship material. Like, the way people talk about this guy and have for years, it's like he's the greatest thing since prime Conor McGregor. And I couldn't disagree more. I think what he is a very well-rounded fighter, a very solid fighter wherever the fight goes. He's a good fighter, don't get me wrong. I just struggled to put him in that elite tier like so many people have. And now it seems like the market is slowly starting to correct to what's probably more accurate of him now that he's gotten older and exposed to a degree, at least in terms of the durability. You know, he fought Timur Valiev, got rocked in that fight, ended up losing a majority decision. He fought Victor Henry, who came in on short notice as a massive underdog, touched him up repeatedly, wobbled him, ended up winning a decision there, and then beat Trevin Jones. Jones did absolutely nothing the entire time and has since got cut by the UFC. So yes, Barcelos, he's back. You know, he looked great in that fight. I'm not convinced, because then he follows that up against Umar Nurmagomedov, and that fight doesn't even look competitive. And obviously Umar is one of the greatest in the division, so he's going to do that to a lot of people, but he knocked him out as well. So now we have a 36-year-old fighter who has never really had great high-level wins to begin with, outside of, one or two fights. Like, he's beaten a lot of very low-level fighters, and now he's 36 years old. The durability's coming into question. He's lost 3 of his last 4 fights, and we're still backing him as a minus 225 favorite. I understand that Miles Johns has his deficiencies, mainly the cardio. We've seen time and time again where he doesn't go to his wrestling base. He does that a lot for whatever reason. He's just a pure boxer. He just doesn't use his wrestling. I know he shot like 12 takedowns in his last fight, wasn't very successful doing that, but he's basically more of just a pure boxer now, and he struggles in terms of the gas tank. So you can take over as the fight goes on against him, but he also does have a couple late round knockout victories. This guy is going to carry his power for 3 rounds. I think that's a concern against a guy like Barcelos, who we know his durability is come into question now. So even if he's up on the scorecards, I expect this fight to be pretty competitive here, and I think Johns has more upside in terms of finishing ability. So in terms of DraftKings, I think Barcelos is a pretty easy fade, because he was never really a big scorer even when he was fighting these low-level guys. 90 points, 85 points, that's not going to do it at his price, especially on a 14-fight slate. So I think the DraftKings conversation is very simple. I think you just don't play Barcelos, and I'm certainly more interested in Miles Johns, because I don't think he's going to be a popular target, because he's not a popular fighter, and we know about the cardio concerns. But I see a scenario where he can touch that chin of an aging fighter whose durability is not as good as it used to be. So I'm leaning towards Johns. Obviously, the most likely outcome is Barcelos wins a decision here. He is the better, more skilled fighter. But I'm more interested in what happens if Johns does pull off the upset at low ownership. I'm going to lean towards Johns on DraftKings and fade Barcelos, and hopefully he's more popular than I'm expecting. Which brings us to our featured bout on the prelims. Now, I'm not sure who decided to put maybe the most boring fight on the entire card as the featured bout of the prelims, but that's above my pay grade. We got Muslim Salikov, a minus 180 favorite over Nicholas Dalby at plus 155, and I mentioned it before, I don't have a ton of interest in this fight. I think it's going to be very boring for the most part. We have 2 low volume guys, 2 boring style of guys. I know Salikov does have clear knockout potential, but he's not throwing a ton of volume. So at times we've seen him kind of get into these low volume, low output staring contests. Now, I do think he has upside to hurt Nicholas Dalby. Dalby's durability is a concern to me. Technically, he's never been knocked out, but he's been hurt and wobbled many times across his career, especially recently. So I do think Salikov does have a little bit of knockout upside, but he's a guy who has to have those big moments or knockouts in order to win fights. And that's just not something I'm looking to back at a minus 180 price tag. And on the flip side, Dalby, he just doesn't do enough for me, man. Like, he's a solid fighter pretty much wherever the fight goes, but he's just another one of those guys that fights on really thin margins. I think his upside here is like a very close, sketchy decision that happens to go his way. Either way, this is a 14-fight slate. I've said it multiple times now, and the reason why I'm reiterating that is because we have so many different combinations to play with. You just don't need to play fights like this if you don't see the upside, and I don't. So we're going Salikov by decision. That's the official pick, but I'm certainly going to be underweight to both sides on DraftKings. Kicking off the main card, we have an absolute banger, probably one of the more exciting matchups on the entire card, as Manuel Torres comes in as a minus 190 favorite with Nicholas Mota on the comeback at plus 160. And basically, there's just no way that this fight doesn't deliver in terms of entertainment value, because Manuel Torres is no stranger to first round fireworks. In fact, of his 15 professional fights, just 1 in his entire career have reached the second round. So basically all of his fights are ending inside of a few minutes. Most of that is due to him finishing guys, but he is also capable of getting himself finished as well. He doesn't have good cardio. It's completely untested, and the few times we have seen him slowly get extended, it just hasn't looked good because everything he does early is very big, explosive, high energy movements. He's very aggressive, very powerful, but he's swinging with everything that he has. He can also land takedowns as well, but they're big power style takedowns that exert a lot of energy. And then on the Mota side, this guy's a good striker. He's basically a counter striker. He does have power. 9 of his 13 wins have come by knockout. The one issue with him is his durability, because we've seen him knocked out as recently as the Jim Miller fight. He was knocked out in the second round, but he's actually been knocked out multiple times in his career. Across the regional scene, he was knocked out twice inside the first round. So there's clearly upside on the Torres if he's able to get that first round knockout over Mota, but there's also upside in Mota in that he's nearly just as capable to land something big because he's such a better counter striker than Torres, who's going to be throwing these big looping style hook shots. And I would favor Mota outside of the first round. So it's going to be one where I think you want exposure to both sides on DraftKings. I'm going to lean with Mota as the official pick. We're taking the dog shot here. I just think as the fight gets extended, if the fight gets extended, it's got to play out more in his favor. And I just think he's the overall cleaner striker. I think he can land one of those powerful counters to put out Torres. So we're going Mota by TKO. That's the official pick. But this is one I think I'm going overweight on both sides, because I mentioned a lot of fights that I think are going the distance here, or maybe the fighters just don't have a ton of upside. I have a hard time seeing how this fight, the winner doesn't score very well on DraftKings. So I think this is clearly one that you want to circle in terms of your exposure this weekend. Which brings us to our next matchup in the featherweight division. We have Pat Sabatini, a minus 190 favorite, with Lucas Almeida on the comeback at plus 160. And I'm between a rock and a hard place here because I love both of these guys. You know, Sabatini's been my guy, but so is Lucas Almeida, and I cashed on him pretty big against Mike Trezano in his UFC debut as an underdog there. And I think I'm going back to the well here because as much as I love Pat Sabatini, and I do think he's going to have a clear grappling advantage here. He comes from a collegiate wrestling background. He's a high-level submission grappler. Where I have concerns is in the striking department, but not just the lack of output and the lack of striking, but the durability as well. We've seen him get rocked multiple times. First, the Jamal Emmers fight, where he got rocked coming in on a takedown, ended up basically out-grappling Emmers after it looked like he was nearly going to be finished, and he ended up submitting Emmers, tore his leg off basically. But that's how dangerous this guy is even when he's dusting off the cobwebs because he's gotten rocked, he is still dangerous enough on the mat to be able to pull off a submission. So you can never really count him out. But I do worry about the striking defense and the durability, because then we saw in the Damon Jackson fight, in his last fight, who's not known for his power whatsoever really, and he ends up rocking him and basically mauling him on the mat until the fight gets stopped there as well. So there's multiple times now where Sabatini just gets sloppy on those takedown entries. I don't like his striking defense, and he's going up against somebody who is a banger on the feet in Lucas Almeida. He also holds a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I think Sabatini's a much higher level grappler, and I don't think Almeida will be able to compete with him really on the mat, but I'm not so sure that Sabatini is going to be able to get those takedowns easily against Almeida, and I think on the feet he's in trouble here. So I think Almeida might be able to catch him with something coming in. We're going Almeida by TKO. That's the official pick, but this is another fight that I think you want to target both sides on DraftKings. Next fight up in the middleweight division, we have Christian Leroy Duncan, a minus 145 favorite now. The comeback on Armen Petrosyan is plus 125. And this is a fun matchup because Armen Petrosyan's a high-level kickboxer, high output, high volume guy. He does give up takedowns, but when he is taken down, he generally pops right back to his feet. He's very difficult to control, so he forces guys to strike with him. And then on the flip side, we have Christian Leroy Duncan, who's a highly touted prospect fighting out of England. He's the former Cage Warriors middleweight champion, and I was looking to fade him in his UFC debut with Dusko Todorovic, who ended up blowing out his knee basically a couple minutes in, so Duncan ended up getting him out of there. But I don't think that's really very predictive of really much moving forward. I think what we have with Duncan is a guy who's very low volume, very low output on the feet. Now, when he does let his hands go, he has big power. There's no denying that, and he looks for those flying knees repeatedly throughout his fights, and I think he's probably going to look for it here against Petrosian, who's going to be the much shorter in terms of reach fighter. You know, Duncan's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage, so if Petrosian's trying to close that distance, he better watch out for those flying knees of Duncan. But outside of him being able to land a big shot and hurt Petrosian, I do think he's probably losing minutes here, because Petrosian, the output is just going to be, I mean, he might triple him up in terms of the numbers. That's how much more volume he's throwing than Duncan. So I think Duncan is finish reliant. He's big moment reliant. And you guys know, if you've listened to me for a while, I'm generally looking to fade fighters like that a lot of times, because especially in a matchup like this, like Petrosian is not a bum. He's not a guy that we have real durability concerns with either. So I just think this is one where it's going to be super close, and I favor the guy who's going to be doing more over 15 minutes, assuming he doesn't get himself hurt at some point. So we're going Petrosian by decision. That's the official pick. Which brings us to the co-main event, as Arman Tsarukyan comes in as the biggest betting favorite on the card at minus 1050, with Joaquim Silva on the comeback at plus 700. And this is one where I think it's going to be a big debate in terms of DraftKings on how to handle this situation, because Tsarukyan came in as the highest priced fighter, not just on this slate, but in DraftKings history at $9,800. Now, if you remember, I've said in the past, historically, that 9,500 mark is generally the mark where once you get above that, it is very difficult to not only pay off that price tag, but to outperform in a way that's good enough to be optimal for that slate. Now, it doesn't mean that Tsarukyan can't do that. We've seen him put up some big scores in the past because he has finishing ability. Basically, wherever the fight goes, he's got excellent cardio. He can mix in the takedowns as well. There's no question that he's probably going to win this fight. But when I keep going back to is like, I think there's an argument to fade Tsarukyan as probably one of the highest owned fighters on the slate. There's an argument to fade him even if this were a 12 fight slate because of his price. The fact that we have a 14 fight slate, I almost want to say it's a no-brainer just to completely ignore him in large field tournaments like the main event on DraftKings, because in small field, sure, just plug him in, take the 100, maybe 100 plus points and move on at chalk ownership. That's fine. But I just think there's so many other different combinations that can outscore Tsarukyan lineups. And if that happens, you're basically eliminating at least a third of the field, depending on how much ownership he comes in with. I just think there's multiple other fighters in the 9K range that are cheaper that have nearly as much upside. We mentioned Teresa Bladea. We mentioned Alessandro Costa. Those are two fighters with round one finishing ability. Even Pat Sabatini, I know I like the dog there, but he's got a ton of upside, round one finishing potential as well. Not to mention the 8K range is completely loaded with guys like Ronnie Lawrence, who's generally DraftKings gold, Manuel Torres, who's got round one finishing ability as well. This slate has so many different combinations and options. I don't want to pigeonhole myself into playing a guy that's so much more expensive than everybody else, that's going to be one of the most popular fighters on the slate, and I just think has a really hard time of being optimal relative to this slate. And I don't need all those other fighters to outperform him every time. Of course, he's going to project better than those guys. I just need one or two of them to outperform him on this night, which is definitely possible. So I just think that's the way I'm going to play it. I think it creates a pretty sizable edge if you play it that way in large field tournaments like the main event on DraftKings, and that's going to be my approach. I'm looking to fade Tsarukyan. Hopefully he doesn't put up 140 points, and if he does, so be it. I'm just dead, but I'm really trying to capture the upside in the event that he scores 105, because that's not going to be enough to be optimal on a 14 fight slate at that ownership. So we're going Tsarukyan by TKO. That's the official pick. But what I'm more interested in is fading him on DraftKings. We'll see if it bites me come Saturday. Which brings us to our main event in the middleweight division, as Marvin Vettori squares up against Jared Cannonier. This fight's currently lined as a pick'em, and I'm leaning towards the Cannonier side here for a couple reasons. For starters, Marvin Vettori looked bad his last time out against Roman Dolidze, and I don't want to weigh that performance too much because I do think it was probably one of the worst he's looked maybe in his career, because in general, he is one of the better fighters in this division. He's a high volume striker, good boxer, extremely durable, tough to put away. He's never been finished, but he's also got a good ground game as well. He's a capable wrestler, brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But on the flip side, like Jared Cannonier is a very good striker, and I do think he's going to be much more powerful than Marvin Vettori, and that's the biggest takeaway to me, is damage is the #1 scoring criteria, and I think it's very clear who's going to be landing the more damaging shots in this fight, and I don't think the output is going to be all that much in favor of Vettori. I actually think it's going to be very competitive in terms of the output, so I'm going to take the guy who's going to be landing the bigger shots, and I don't really see Vettori being able to have much grappling success here, even if he tries to do that at all, which I'm not sure that he will. So I'm leaning with Cannonier. I think just the more bigger shots are going to come from his side, and that has me leaning towards him in this matchup. So we're going Cannonier by decision. That's the official pick. And as always, fightnumbers.com will have my DraftKings player rankings, ownership projections, MMA line movement, a bunch of other stuff. It's completely free. I'll pin it in the comments. If you didn't already, please subscribe. I definitely appreciate it. Best of luck, and we'll see you guys next time.